It seems that Pastor William G. Huffman came back to his Cape Girardeau home fairly late, looking pretty pale and shaken, one night in mid-April of 41. His family was very concerned, so he said, "I'll tell you this once, and I will never tell you what happened to me again." He said he received a phone call from someone earlier that evening, presumably from a Cape policeman or police associate, to go to an airplane crash reported outside of town to see if the Reverend could offer some amount of spiritual comfort. When the two men got to the crash site, they found a fire blazing, being fought by firemen. It surrounded a crashed metal spaceship that was silvery gray and round. It was damaged, laying on the ground with metallic debris in the grass. Nearby were three identical gray aliens, almost as if they were released from a cookie cutter. The aliens that we recovered were, quote, incinerated from within, so they could not breathe our atmosphere and had burned their inner organs, and that's why they would appear intact on the outside, as they did in Cape Girardeau.
Without any damage to the surface of their bodies.
That's correct. The aliens were pulled from the Cape Girardeau crash, and two were set out in the grass side by side, and a third was attempting to breathe. Reverend Huffman said he could see this one's chest going up and down until it finally expired. And two of them were clearly dead and lifeless. A third was gasping for air in the grass, laying on his back, unable to breathe our oxygen-rich atmosphere. None of the three had any visible injuries. Reverend Huffman said prayers over the last creature before it died and went limp right in front of him. Then he got up and he peeked into the spaceship through the damaged hole and noticed its small instrument panel and dials and knobs and even a couple of small seats, along with a silver metal band around the inside of this cockpit or flight deck, and it was studded with odd, indecipherable symbols. At the site were FBI agents, policemen, firemen, and at least two newsmen with big flash cameras blazing, and assorted farm people picking through the rubble. One dead alien was actually propped up and posed in a photograph.
Can you give a detailed description now from the top of the head to the bottom of the feet of what you have learned from people who saw the photo?
There were no feet visible in the photo. However, Charlotte Mann said that when she saw it many times, the creature was being propped up under the arms by two men, one in shirt sleeves, one in a light waistcoat, she calls it. And the creature had a large, bulbous head with big, black, shiny eyes, just almost like a doll's eyes. And it had almost no nostrils, maybe tiny dots, and a slit for a mouth, just very tiny. Long, thin arms and legs, and gray with a crinkly, silvery-looking skin or coating of some kind, or flight suit. And that it clearly had the three fingers and one long thumb per hand in a flash photo. The person who took the picture, according to Reverend Huffman, stuck the camera back in his shirt pocket where he had found it. This was his second camera. He was also using a large speed graphic type flashbulb camera as if he was a newsman. And this same person came to the Huffman home 2 weeks later and handed over a copy of the photograph he took with the smaller camera and said, "I have a copy of this. I want you to have a copy of this."
That confusion about using the large flash camera and a smaller camera, does that reinforce for you the possibility that this person taking photos at the extraterrestrial crash site in Cape Girardeau was working for a military agency?
I find it very likely this was a local newsman who was called and rushed to the site, and he was a big photo camera bug, and he had one with him that was a smaller one, but he had a working news-type camera with a flash attachment and was taking pictures at that time with it, and maybe ran out of camera film is what I'm thinking, why he produced a second smaller camera that he smuggled past the Army and got out of the site.
Paul, why wasn't this on the front page of every Missouri newspaper the very next day with the photo or photos this man took?
Apparently, according to Reverend Huffman, everyone was sworn to secrecy. And when you think about it, if you were to come forward after the crash when everyone else was sworn to secrecy and say, "I was there, I took pictures of a flying saucer that crashed and aliens," you would probably be drummed out of your job and out of your church, and You would lose your way of life in the area and probably lose the respect of people who had no idea that it was the truth.
But the evidence would have been there. It would have been the photo in the paper, and it could have cracked it open, and the truth could have been there right back in April of 1941.
I find it very possible that someone went to the editor of the Cape Girardeau newspaper and told him, "You will not run this story. I don't care if you did hear from your newsman who told you all about it." It's interesting to note that President Harry Truman invited the editor and owner of the paper, the publisher, to the White House twice during his presidency. And when his presidency was over, he visited the newspaper's headquarters in Cape Girardeau twice. And on one visit, the report in the paper said Harry cleared the room of all reporters, friends, and aides to both men and wanted to discuss something that was very secret between himself and the newspaper owner, and it was never revealed later. The Army showed up, surrounded the site, and took people off to the side in groups to warn them and swear them to silence. Do not speak of this. This never happened. This is a matter of national security. You will keep your mouths shut. Put down all notes and photos and debris. So they did as they were told, including Reverend Huffman. And he left with his police associate and went home. And that's when he told the story that night. And as I said, he apparently kept his mouth shut for the rest of his life. 2 weeks later, after the crash, a photographer walked up to the Huffman home on Main Street in Cape and gave William a copy of a snapshot he took with a secondary smaller camera he kept hidden in his pocket. It was of the alien being propped up by two men in civilian attire. One man was in shirt sleeves. It was so warm. It was the gray, big-headed alien in the picture, about 4 feet in height. And it scared Charlotte when she saw it about a dozen or so years later.
Charlotte Mann was his granddaughter.
Correct. She claims she saw the picture at least 12 times, maybe more, when she was a little girl growing up in a small town in Kansas. Her father would trot out the picture at family parties, and she heard little mentions of this Cape Girardeau UFO crash incident.
Was the person calculated on the part of counterintel to befriend the father specifically to get the photo and never return it?
Well, Reverend Huffman's son, Guy Huffman, ran a furniture store in a small town in Kansas. Across the street was an insurance salesman, and his name was Walter Wayne Fisk. And Mr. Fisk struck up conversations in this small town with Guy Huffman, and the subject came around to extraterrestrials. And that's when Guy Huffman mentioned he had a photograph that he wanted Mr. Fisk to take a look at. Fisk was most keen to see it, came over to a dinner party one night and said, "Well, this is most interesting. I'll take it home and look at it more closely since I'm a photographic expert, and I'll tell you whether I think it's a fake or not." He did not only not return the picture, he left town shortly thereafter, and they never saw him again. There was a story in the Los Angeles Times a number of years ago that revealed that AIG Insurance Company was invented as a front for American intelligence to squeeze information out of Americans. It was co-run by General William Donovan, who worked for Franklin Roosevelt, and they would send intelligence agents out into the field posing as insurance agents to get Americans to talk about their personal and private lives and feed back the information to intelligence headquarters. It could be that Walter Fisk was one of these agents, an Army intel officer who was working in insurance to gather information, and when he found the photograph, at least in theory, he hit the jackpot. He knew that this was something that had to be scooped up and gotten away from the Huffman family and away from the entire American public. That's a hypothesis.
What is the best information about where the 3 dead small gray alien bodies were taken, and where was the damaged craft taken?
Apparently, they were all taken by the Sikeston, Missouri Institute for Aeronautics, an Army air base that was called in that night. The Sikeston MIA Army people were involved, and it's interesting to note that Charles Root was in charge of the Sikeston MIA Air Base, and that he was transferred to Sikeston directly from big shots in Washington, D.C. So if the crash happened that night, that might explain how someone could have contacted the nearest airbase, which was in Sikeston, about 35, 40 miles away from Cape Girardeau, and how they could have gotten direct orders from Washington to go into the site, take everything over, and haul it back to Sikeston, where it was held probably for about a day or two and flown out.
In your book on page 249, you write, at the time that FDR died, Harry Truman was found down inside the U.S. Capitol building, off limits to the public, according to historians. He hurried out of the building and by car over to the White House, where he was sworn in. So of all the places Truman could have been 4 years after April 12, 1941, he was either on the very same floor that the 3 alien bodies from Cape Girardeau were stored in the subterranean Capitol.
Right. Turns out in the 1990s, 2 sisters came forward in the state of Ohio and said that their father told them back in the 40s that he had been a visitor to Washington, D.C., and that his cousin, the Secretary of State, Cordell Hull, who worked directly for Franklin Roosevelt, escorted Reverend Turner Holt downstairs to the U.S. Capitol building's sub-basement. From there, he was shown a special storeroom. Inside were 3 dead aliens inside 3 glass jars, completely uninjured, matching the same exact description of Reverend Huffman. They were big-headed with big black eyes, and 2 arms and 2 legs were most thin with 3 fingers and 1 thumb, and they were gray and floating in what appeared to be clear formaldehyde. Mr. Hull told Reverend Holt that these were creatures from another world, but we can't discuss this. He also showed off from underneath a tarp pieces of a round metallic silvery gray spaceship. It was cut into sections in order to fit it into the building. The Masons are wild about the Capitol building for some reason. Almost every member of the Roosevelt administration, it seems, was a Freemason, including the Vice President, Henry A. Wallace, who had an office in the U.S. Capitol building. FDR was said to have been a 33rd degree Mason. He and Harry Truman were both powerful Democrats in those days, and they were both very devout Freemasons. Harry was the Grand Master Mason of the state of Missouri. He was a very powerful figure getting ready to start his Truman Committee on Military Hearings on Capitol Hill at the time of the UFO crash in Cape Girardeau. So it seems apparent that at least for a little while, the materials were flown from Sikeston, Missouri to Washington, D.C., and not knowing quite what to do with it, President Roosevelt directed George Marshall to take them downstairs to this sub-basement storeroom where they would be well guarded by security and police, and there was almost no one who was aware of these subterranean rooms, but it turns out quite true. I've read many times that there are a number of floors, maybe up to 7 floors down below the surface of the Capitol building. There's actually more room underneath the floor of the Capitol than there is above the congressional floors. There was a memo that Franklin Roosevelt sent to his top scientist, Dr. Vannevar Bush, in 1942, where he discusses Dr. Bush's desire to get more scientific access to the materials recovered by the Army, celestial wonders, as he called them.
That means Harry S. Truman had hard first-hand working knowledge of these 4-foot-tall beings from outer space, retrieved from a crash in Cape Girardeau in April of 41, long before the July 47 crashes in Roswell.
That is correct. And it also brings us back to another document called the White House Intelligence Estimate, written by General Nathan Twining for President Truman in September of 1947, in which he mentions in print, and you can still see this today on the Majestic Documents site, quote, even the recovery case of 1941 did not create a unified intelligence effort. And later on, he stated, quote, based on all evidence collected from recovered exhibits, these items from Roswell are deemed extraterrestrial in nature.
Is there any insight from that 41 period in any document, any leak, anywhere that denotes what the government thought the agenda was of these small gray beings? Were they friendly, unfriendly? Was this part of the danger that FDR perceived?
That's a wonderful question, and I honestly have no idea. I have never read a single document or heard a statement as to whether Roosevelt was nervous or upset or excited or what their emotional reaction to this was. I can tell you that on April 12, 1941, when the crash happened, President Roosevelt was up very late in the White House, rather unusually late. He didn't go back upstairs to his personal quarters where he lived alone, separate from Eleanor, until after midnight, and where he had two telephones to take and make phone calls. At that same time, Eleanor Roosevelt was in Boston, and suddenly, for some reason, her flight was canceled. She and her entourage had to get their bags off the plane, get a taxi, drive across town, go to the train station, and stay on the ground and travel back to Washington, D.C., down the coast in the early morning hours of Easter Sunday. She wrote in her column, "We so look forward to the Knights Templar ceremony at Arlington Cemetery every Easter sunrise, but they didn't make it. Neither Franklin or Eleanor showed up. And they did make it to a late church service around noon in Washington, D.C., and the records show very little activity for the rest of the day. This would have been the day after the crash, according to my estimate."
April 13th, 1941.
Right. So on April 12th, I looked up the records of General George Marshall, the chief of the Army for President Roosevelt. He was down in Camp Shelby, Mississippi, and he was due to fly to Fort Benning in Georgia. He has a printed itinerary. That's all checked down to Saturday night, where it suddenly stops cold, and there's no record of where he went or what he did Saturday night or Sunday, as if he may have been grounded also. It's difficult to pin this down, but he did show up at his office in Washington, D.C. Monday morning and met with President Roosevelt in the days to come. There are no White House telephone records from that period, which is most discouraging. It would have been extremely helpful. But in the days after the crash, some of the biggest of the big shots of the American military, including General Marshall, came rolling into the Oval Office for meetings. And one point at 11:45, a few days after the crash, Dr. Vannevar Bush, who's been in many UFO documents, named as someone who's working on the Mo 41 materials, came into the Oval Office for an appointment with Dr. Ross McIntyre, the president's physician. It was a very strange pairing, and I asked Ryan Wood about this, and he speculated, but most reasonably. Dr. Bush would have been there to discuss the autopsy of the spaceship recovered. Dr. McIntyre would have been there to discuss the autopsy of the bodies recovered. These were the two men Roosevelt trusted the most, and somebody had to take charge of this material, the hardware and the bodies, and investigate it thoroughly. But we have to remember that in the 1940s and the early 40s, there was no Pentagon, there was no CIA, there was no National Security Council. None of these things existed. Where would you take aliens where they would be kept under guard and could be examined without too much fuss if the president or vice president showed up to take a look for himself or his Army chief of staff? And that would have been the U.S. Capitol building where Vice President Wallace had an office.
How do you think that Harry Truman became aware of the aliens and the extraterrestrial craft at Cape Girardeau in April of 1941?
It is purely speculation, but Mr. Truman was conducting military hearings on Capitol Hill in which he had to deal with General Marshall, who was the person in charge of recovering the Missouri artifacts and hiding them and keeping them under wraps, possibly in the Capitol building, at least for a little while. So I would assume it could have been around that time when Marshall told Harry what they pulled from his home state. Now, once again, that is just speculation on my part.
In April of 1941, what was the title and position of Harry S. Truman?
April of 41, he was starting his second term as Senator of Missouri. He had just won the fall 1940 re-election campaign. Marshall was sworn in and was a hearing committee witness, one of the first ones, in mid-April of 1941, just after the Easter Passover break, in which almost all of this extraterrestrial business took place. One of the first things that was done, Harry met with General Marshall and swore him in, and he gave testimony before the Truman Committee on Capitol Hill.
About?
That was about military funding and waste in government and funding projects that had to do with supporting the Army. At that time, Harry might have been told. He was a Senate leader, but not the majority leader, and he was very fond of Speaker of the House Rayburn from Texas, and they were both very hardcore Freemasons who keep lots of secrets, and they loved that Capitol building. So Harry may well have been told, I just don't know when and by who.
But it would explain why FDR would reach out to Harry Truman in the re-election in 1944.
That is correct.
And that Harry S. Truman, as a Freemason in colleagueship with George Marshall, would have been a logical choice.
Right. General Marshall and Hap Arnold, the head of the Air Corps turned Air Force in 41, were both hardcore Freemasons. You almost couldn't become a part of the Roosevelt inner circle or cabinet without being a Freemason, including the director of the FBI, J. Edgar Hoover. And they would all meet at Washington Masonic sites, and there might have been a Masonic meeting room under the Capitol. If so, that might explain once again why trusted Freemasons would keep this amazing secret under the Capitol, where it would be guarded by police and maybe even the military.
FDR, Truman, George Marshall, Vannevar Bush, all of them knew about alien beings and extraterrestrial technology by April 12th, 1941.
That's correct. And in one of FDR memos, he mentioned we need to restrict this information. It was something you didn't talk about, and barely behind closed doors and with certain right people. You didn't talk about it, certainly with the press or the public. I'll give you a small example. There's a story of a man named Philip Reynolds who came forward in 2012. His grandfather was Mr. Walter Reynolds, a Cape Girardeau fireman. On his deathbed, Walter had cancer. He apparently confessed that not only is Pastor Huffman's story true, he said, I ought to know, I was there fighting the flames, saw the bodies, I peeked into the spaceship too, and that he picked up some of the crash debris. The Army caught him trying to pocket it, and they forced him to turn it over, booted him from the crash site, and in the aftermath, he felt that he was being watched, spied on around town, and that his telephone was tapped.
It was not too long after, just a few months, that in February of 1942, the Los Angeles Times carried a story of American artillery shooting at what appears in a photograph to be a glowing diamond over the Santa Monica Mountains. It's referred to as the Battle of L.A., and our government tried to get away with explaining that they were shooting at what they thought was an invasion from Japan following what had happened in Hawaii only a month and a half before.
Right.
But we now have documents between George Marshall and FDR referring to celestial vehicles, bringing down two celestial vehicles, one in San Bernardino and one in the Santa Monica Mountains. That would have been then not long after the Cape Girardeau revelation.
That's correct. President Roosevelt relied so heavily on George Marshall, and we have a 42 memo that was leaked around the year 2000 discussing the application of this non-terrestrial know-how in atomic energy and how it should be used to perfect a superweapon of war. FDR was burning with rage after Pearl Harbor, and he wanted something done, anything that would give us an advantage over the Nazis and the Japanese Imperial Army. He wrote to General Marshall, finding practical uses for the atomic secrets learned from the study of celestial devices. It is important for exploring further application in this new wonder. And in a 1944 memorandum to Dr. Vannevar Bush's Non-Terrestrial Science and Technology Committee, Roosevelt emphasized again the application of non-terrestrial know-how in atomic energy must be used in perfecting our superweapons of war. We must take advantage of such wonders that have come to us. And I congratulate you on coming to grips with the reality that our planet is not the only one harboring intelligent life in the universe.
Why do you think that Franklin Delano Roosevelt, his Vice President Harry S. Truman, his advisor Vannevar Bush, and others Why would they have immediately wanted to keep this a secret from the American public in a government that is supposed to be of, by, and for the people?
It boils down to secrecy at all costs is often the motto of the Army intelligence. So it was best to avoid a panic at all costs and just cover things up until at least we knew what was going on. And I think that happened first in Cape Girardeau, and that was the policy going forward probably to this day.
Have you ever had anybody talk about a threat, an unfriendly, non-human among the many that seem to be interacting with this planet?
No, I don't believe I've read of anyone in a condition of fear or feeling that we were going to be invaded, that we were being threatened. People in government apparently were satisfied that these creatures were of a scientific nature, observing us without getting involved, and it was just purely an accident that they crashed near Missouri and Roswell, New Mexico, 6 years later. We are not being represented well, are we, by our government or people in power within the military who know the answers to these secrets, and they're not serving us with the truth. It seems apparent that Dr. Vannevar Bush began examining the craft and found atomic propulsion system, neutronic in nature, and thought, we can possibly apply this to our atomic bomb program. And from there, boy, secrecy came down hard and fast. It was a race to see who could perfect the atomic bomb, and America very much wanted to win, especially after we were attacked in December of 41, and things looked very bad in 41 and 42 for this country. We had to develop our nuclear weapon program and outrace the Germans and the Japanese, and when they applied all of this atomic know-how from the alien crash, that really led to what Dr. Otto Krauss called in 1962 a subject that is more top secret than the atom bomb itself. He said this in a test of the atom bomb in Nevada in 62. Someone asked how we could have such advanced atom bomb weaponry. He replied, there was a crash in the Ozarks. When asked to clarify, he said, it was a UFO that crashed in Missouri in 1941. This is an eminent physicist who knew what was going on.
In 2016, what is your own personal perspective on this strict policy of denial and lies since World War II and Cape Girardeau, keeping from the American people the truth that we're not alone in this universe, never have been, and that our government has been back engineering extraterrestrial technology and keeping it all from us?
I would like to see information finally admitted to. They can do what is called in the CIA a limited hangout, in which they reveal some things but not everything. It's not necessary anymore, in my opinion, to keep these secrets from the American public. The basic fact that we are being observed, and a few of these creatures have crashed on American soil, and that they do not represent a threat to us, but we can only count on our democratic form of government in America to hopefully give us the truth someday.
As you write about the controversy over the death of FDR, that ever since the April 12, 1945 announcement that FDR had died of a cerebral hemorrhage, dozens of people have leaked that it wasn't just a hemorrhage, that he had asked for a gun and shot himself in the head.
He may have made the decision to take himself out to end his misery. Roosevelt was a devout Freemason, and Masons always show up at the funeral of a fellow member to perform services, but they did not in FDR's case, not at the White House and not at Hyde Park. Very, very suspicious that, once again, Masons will not show up if you commit suicide. We're talking about 1944. Franklin Roosevelt left the White House with only a handful of aides and convalesced in South Carolina at a private estate by the seashore. His secretary recorded in her diary at that time, her great surprise, that the president asked seriously that a loaded handgun be brought to him. Now, he made it through that period of time. It was very difficult for his health, but obviously he had a loaded gun on his mind, and a year later he made it up to April of 45, the 4-year anniversary of the Cape Girardeau UFO crash. He separated himself from the White House and almost all of his assistants and all of his family and traveled to Georgia, where only a couple of secretaries and a couple of aides came with him. He spent almost 2 weeks in Warm Springs at what was called the Little White House, when he allegedly, pulled out a loaded gun from his lap robe and ended his life, knowing that he was probably dying anyway. It was the exact 4-year anniversary date of the Mo 41 crash, and it made the new president, Harry Truman of Missouri. Truman told the press, "I feel like the moon, the stars, and all the planets just fell on me," which is a highly ironic statement coming from the 4-year anniversary of what happened in Cape Girardeau, a town he knew fairly well. In 2005, so many people started chiming in on online forums with their own family narratives of how they had been told long ago by an FBI agent, a Marine Guard, a nurse, the Secret Service, someone in their family had been told by various sources the same story, that Franklin Roosevelt pulled out a gun and ended his own life, and that they had to go with the story of a cerebral hemorrhage, which was technically true.
Leaving out the bullet.
Right.
Was there any clue from Eleanor Roosevelt, his wife?
I did not find any. However, it's very interesting to note, she arrived around midnight, took a plane from Washington, D.C. down to Warm Springs, and immediately ordered the president's casket closed to everyone. Not even family members were allowed to see the president's body. Morticians had wrapped a bandage around his forehead, which is very strange considering the fact that he had died of so-called natural causes. The casket was closed, and it was taken to Washington on a train, and in D.C., not any family or friends were allowed to view the body at any time. The casket was kept closed in the White House and at Hyde Park, and he was buried promptly without anyone inspecting. All medical notes and almost every bit of health information was supposedly lost. In other words, kept from the public, maybe destroyed.